So, in the last lecture, we saw some problems with utilitarianism as an approach to distributive justice. And I think this gets at the substance of Rawls' criticisms of utilitarianism as an approach to distributive justice. But if we don't want to be utilitarians, well, how can we approach this issue? Rawls wants to take a Kantian approach. And he does this because he thinks Kantianism does very well with fairness, right? We've seen this, it's kind of baked into Kantianism that fairness is one of the basic concepts. When you get this formula of universal law, don't will principles that you couldn't will as a universal law. If you wouldn't want others to follow it when you're involved, don't will it as a principle. So that really shoots down any unfair principles, right? So if justice is so closely linked with fairness, and if Kantianism does really well with fairness, if fairness is really just part of the ground level of Kantianism, then this seems a pretty natural approach. So, and one way to think of what Rawls is doing is to think about Kant's formula of universal law. So remember the formula of universal law. Could you will this principle as a universal law? Could you will that everyone always do this? The idea is to get principles that at least in theory everyone could agree to. So part of what Rawls is doing, and I think a really good way to think about Rawls' approach, is to just see Rawls as saying, well, let's find some political principles that everyone could agree to. How should we think about distributive justice as well as other questions of justice? Well, we should come up with some principles everyone could agree to, and then we'll use those principles to settle these things. Well, I'm going to guess that you're very skeptical of that to start with, right? I think the natural response to Rawls here is like, okay, Rawls, that sounds really nice. That sounds wonderful. Never in a million years are you going to get any actual principles out of that, right? There are no principles everyone can agree to, we might say, because people don't agree, right? And we don't agree, we basically have these just fundamental clashes in our values when it comes to this. But a lot of times we also will pick principles that are in our interest, right? And we don't have to think that people are dishonest or selfish or whatever. We see our own side of things better, so we just kind of naturally pick principles that favor us, right? Since I started working for a community college, I am much more sure that we should have principles that better fund community colleges. It was something that wasn't really on my radar before I started working for a community college, right? Everyone else is going to, their own experience is going to lead them to principles that, even if they're not trying to be selfish, in a lot of ways privilege them, right? So you might say, well, Rawls, that sounds fun, that sounds dandy, but you know what? We're not going to get anywhere because there are no such principles everyone can agree to. Well, it is to solve precisely this problem that Rawls comes up with his original position. You heard Dworkin talk about the original position in the clip. Well, the original position isn't just some clever little idea. It's actually a way Rawls thinks that we can find some principles we can all agree to, that we can get past these things that set us up to disagree. Okay, so what is the original position? Now Dworkin talks about this, and I think he does a very good job of explaining it. But I think it's also good to take a second pass and say a little bit more, go in a bit more detail. So, as Dworkin says, one useful way to think of the original position is a sort of constitutional convention, right? The original position, it isn't an actual convention where everybody gets together, but it's a sort of thought experiment, right? We're to imagine a convention like this. Imagine that we're all coming together to pick the very basic principles for our society. Something like a constitution, right? These are the principles that will govern all the laws in our society. Well, but here is where Rawls gets creative. So first off, Rawls says, well, let's just imagine that everybody in this constitutional convention, this original position, is just looking out for themselves. They're only worried about what happens to them when when this is all over. And you'll say, well, oh goodness, that's just going to make it even worse. Well, but the next bit is the really clever part. Rawls says, let's imagine that no one here knows what place they'll occupy in society. They might be rich, they might be poor, they might be something in between. They also don't know who they are. They might be black, they might be white, they might be very religious, they might be hardcore atheists, they might have incredible athletic talent that can make them millions of dollars. They might have some other talent that can make a lot of money. They might not be able to do anything that people particularly want to pay money for, right? You might come out of the original position and find that you're Bill Gates. You might come out of the original position and find that you're a janitor, right? You might come out and find that you are unemployed and can't even get a job, right? You might be a member of the mainstream religion, whatever that is. Or you might come out and find that you're a member of some religion that everybody really dislikes for the most part, but that religion's really important to you, right? You might be a businessman with a very conservative lifestyle. You might be a hippie living on a commune. You don't know any of that. It is a complete lottery who you will be in society and what you will have. So Rawls says, now imagining that you don't know who you are and what place you will occupy in the society, then what kinds of principles would you choose? Think about that. You are going to pick, Rawls will say, fair principles, because any principle that's unfair, any principle that is to the advantage of one group of people over another, well, that might be just dandy for you. You might be in the group of people who get the unfair advantage, but it's just as likely that you'll be in the group that suffers from this unfair advantage. So you will only pick fair principles because any unfair principle you pick might blow up in your face. So think about that. But before you go into the next lecture, think about that. What principles would you pick from this original position? Would you, from the original position, would you want to pick some principles that protect against discrimination on grounds of religion or race, or on grounds of gender? Would you want protections from, say, being harassed by the police because you are a member of an unpopular group or they just don't like you, right? What about income? Would you, from the original position, just say, well, let things shake out however they will? If people are rich, they're rich, and if they're poor, who cares? In fact, if they're poor and they can't afford food, they can just starve. Or would you be very concerned about how society treats the poor if you were in this original position? Think about that. I mean, before, you know, Dworkin, if you've listened to the clip, discusses all this. I will discuss all this in the next lecture. But before you click on the next lecture, just think about these questions a bit. What kinds of principles would you pick from the original position? What kinds of principles would it make sense to pick from the original position? Rawls thinks, this is a thought experiment, but in asking ourselves this question, Rawls thinks we'll step away from our sort of individual prejudices, and this will allow us to get away to fair principles.